HuHa 2, ha!
Happy Harry's HuHa 2 Patridge!
Hello and welcome to Happy Harry's HuHa 2 How-Tos, episode 8. And today we're going to be talking about shading and lighting for your animated projects, and then we'll make a smooth radio DJ-like transition into talking about backgrounds and drawing backgrounds for your cartoons. But there's a heck of a lot we have to cover today, so there really is not a moment to lose. Okay, we could stand to lose that moment, but now we really have to get going. This is a circle, but I'd like it to be a sphere. Now, one of the cool things about working with lighting is it allows us to transform our two-dimensional drawings into three-dimensional objects or characters that have more of a sense of mass to them and structure, and I'll show you how. Here, of course, we just have our circle. There's no indication really that it's a sphere, but by adding one single light here, we get kind of three things out of it, just simply by having a light shining on the right hand side which throws the left hand side into darkness and casts a shadow. We get to see both what the object is, by seeing now that it's a sphere and not a circle because it clearly has mass. We also get to see where it is. We can tell that it's not hovering here sort of a few feet off the ground with a shadow below it. We can see the shadow is rooted to the bottom of the sphere, which means that no, the thing is actually on the ground. And also, we get a sense of mood, which is really important for storytelling, but I'll come back to that later. Here is just another example of a simple two-point lighting setup. It's a little more complicated, obviously, than the one-point lighting setup, and maybe a little too complicated for animation, but it's an interesting notion, I think, to bear in mind, that you can put your light anywhere, not just left or right and up and down, but you can put it sort of on the z-axis towards you or away from you. And here's another example with a light sort of nearer us as the audience, shining onto our object, but not simply illuminating it completely and making it look flat. Now you may be thinking, Harry, you noxious pool of festering innards, I know how to shade a simple 3D object, and that's probably true, and that's really good. But the reason that this becomes really helpful later on is not just because it's useful to shade 3D objects, but it can help us with shading complicated things like a full-on cartoon character. And here's a really great tip that I completely nabbed from the book How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. Basically, they deal with showing you 3D shapes to begin with and teaching you on how to light those simple 3D shapes. And I'm pretty sure this is something that you could probably handle. Here I've just put a bunch of very simple lighting setups next to these shapes to show how they'll look lit up. But the application comes into play when we have the cartoon character, which may be kind of challenging to light if you've never really tried to think of a cartoon character as a 3D object. If we break it down, however, like this, into pretty simple geometric shapes, we've got our sphere, we've got kind of a cube for the body, even though it's a little bent, have cylinders for the arms and legs, and again sort of bendy cubes for the hands and feet. It becomes a lot easier, I think, to visualize that and light that as so, and sort of teach us the principles behind lighting a character who's always going to be constructed basically out of those same shapes. Here's that same character again with that sort of lighting applied to it, which we really got from looking at the character made out of 3D shapes. One more quick tip, remember the light source and its position will actually affect the shape of the shadow cast by the subject. For example, a really low light will mean that you get a really long shadow, and then you'll see this in the summertime when the sun creeps up higher during the day, shadow gets shorter and shorter until it's practically nothing. Now, not every cartoon out there deals with shadows and lighting, and I understand why. When you're creating all these frames from scratch, simplifying things is often the way to go, and it can be a heck of a lot of work to have to add on shadows and lighting and all that other stuff. But if it's something that you want to try out, bear in mind there are kind of different ways you can do it. Here we have a character who's not been shaded or lit up at all. You can still colour him in a way that could kind of hint that he's in shadows, and that's sort of something we looked at last week a little bit. But obviously what we've already looked at is the basic lighting setup with him kind of casting a shadow and having shadows on him and his body. Another way is to actually just sort of draw the highlights onto the character, which gives kind of a different effect, and something that I very rarely see, but is also something you could consider, is combining the two, which I think personally looks a little bit too busy, but it's sort of still interesting. And ultimately, maybe that's something that you should only need to use a very small percentage of the time. Maybe most of the time you won't deal with lighting, but then you decide you want to go for a certain mood. And that's one thing that lighting is really cool and useful at doing, is creating mood. Just to give you an idea of the different kind of moods that you can create with lighting, I have the same head here which I've set up with different lighting styles to give you an idea of what can be achieved. Now this is sort of a flat kind of 3/4 on lighting setup, which is pretty emotionless, I'd say. Lighting the character from the side makes them look a lot more mysterious, as does backlighting, where the character is almost thrown completely into darkness, but we have this sort of rim of light around the edge here. Lighting a character from directly above makes them look pretty unnerving, I think. I think maybe not ugly, but sort of a little shadowy, both literally and figuratively, and a little bit untrustworthy. And finally we have like that kind of horror comic book style lighting, which is directly from below, which you might do when you're telling campfire stories. But that's just to get you guys thinking about what you can do with lighting. Now I'm going to make a really ungraceful shift to talking about the second part of today's lesson, which is backgrounds and working with perspective. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about perspective, and not the kind of perspective that you get from mind-bending drugs, although this may potentially be kind of mind-bending. I'm not sure I've actually got my head around it yet. But the kind of perspective that we do with drawing, and lending our drawings realistic 3D values and properties, and really locking them into a 3D space and making them look very convincing. Now, this all starts off with a horizon line, which is basically our eye level line, or our camera level line, but it doesn't have to be in the middle of the screen. You could have it up high, or you could have it down low, or you could have it at a crazy axis like that and make it diagonal, but there can only be one, kind of like Highlander. And basically the horizon line, because it's our eye level line, everything above the horizon line will be looking up at, and everything below our horizon line will be looking down upon. And that's kind of pointless in itself, but it becomes very important when we add something called a vanishing point. Now, a vanishing point has to be locked onto the horizon line. It can't be floating above or below it. But we can add as many as we like, and to begin I'm going to add two. I'm going to add one here on the right and one over here on the left. Now if we draw new lines intersecting with our vanishing point here, and by introducing a straight vertical line, we can create brand new 3D objects that are pretty consistently set within our 3D world, because they disappear into the horizon. If you had a 3D object that disappeared, but it disappeared up into kind of that direction, into a different horizon, then you'd have problems, and that 3D illusion would be broken. So basically, perspective is the practice of helping us nail down where our 3D objects are sort of disappearing into, and setting it in a real 3D location. Okay, now very quickly I'm going to draw another object here on the floor using our same vanishing points. And this is going to be something that we're actually looking down at, because the object that we've drawn previously, we're both sort of looking down at the bottom of it, but it's actually taller than us, so we're looking up at the very top. And this is going to be just a flat kind of cube on the ground. What you do end up with, of course, is a big mess of squares, or lines I should say rather, as they all begin to intersect. I'm going to draw another object here floating in the sky like a kind of video game platform that is going to be something that we're looking up at. Now, of course, the perspective here is very extreme, and that tends to happen when you have your vanishing points quite close together on a horizon. If they were much further apart, they'd probably be off the page. So oftentimes, I end up putting my vanishing points kind of off the page and almost doing a bit of guesswork and a bit of cheat work. But hey, if that's what you have to do, as long as you understand the basics of how perspective works, then you should be okay. And we've basically just gone and drawn some more grey, bland-looking cubes. But hey, at least they're in perspective. And if you understand the basics of perspective, like I say, with the horizon line, objects disappearing as they go away from us, looking up at objects, looking down at objects, that should be enough for us to move on to the next area, which is actually drawing backgrounds and putting characters in them. So, drawing backgrounds, it can be really tough. I remember when I was growing up, I only really wanted to draw cartoon characters, and really didn't spend any time learning to draw things like buildings and boats and trees and nature and all that kind of stuff that can make it really difficult if you want to draw backgrounds. Luckily, the internet then came along and Google Image came along, and we basically have a fantastic reference library for almost anything you can imagine. So use that. There's no way I can go into the specifics of how to draw lots of different backgrounds today because it's too much for me to cover, but we can at least start to think about designing backgrounds and sort of how your characters fit into their world. So here I have this kind of copyright-free, I hope, Gerald McBoing Boing ripoff, and the little world that he inhabits, which looks very much like him, kind of a little bit like The Simpsons, the way that the characters really match their backgrounds. They're drawn with the sort of same line thickness and a similar color palette. And it works. I think it could be better, and I'll show you a few changes that I would make to this along the way. Now on the other end of the scale, we have the really detailed kind of backgrounds. Again, it's not realistic, but it's been sort of detailed with lots of sort of different shades and little lines and things like that. And the character is, again, a lot more rendered and has more detail to him. Now, both of these characters fit in their surroundings, and I don't have a problem with either of these setups. But, as something to consider, you could switch them around so that you have your sort of more detailed characters possibly I turned southern there, possibly popping out of their backgrounds a little more by sort of emphasizing their level of detail and simplifying their surroundings. Alternatively, something that I think probably works a little better is having detailed backgrounds but simple characters. And of course, when you're animating and drawing characters over and over again where backgrounds remain pretty static, it's probably a better idea to make your characters simple. But just something that I would suggest is if you're going to do the first background setup, which is quite simple, consider using a different color than your character's outline color to outline your backgrounds. For example, I've got the same background here actually outlined in blue, and that looks pretty good, I think. In fact, if we sit our character into the background with blue outlines, I think he pops a little more, because black is obviously a much more bold colour than this sort of blue. And colour choices are obviously important to consider all over. I've actually gone for a very sort of muted pink and blue background for this character, because he's orange, and that sort of will stick out quite well. If I can revert back to the colour wheel last week, that is a pretty complementary combination. And finally, I've got a little background here that doesn't have any lines whatsoever. It's pretty much just pure blocks of colour, which the character will probably pop out from also pretty darn well. But now I'm going to create a very quick, rough little background and show you my working as I go. Okay, so here I have a really crappy kind of thumbnail background, the kind of quality that I draw my storyboards in, and I'm going to do a little bit of pre-cleanup here before I do my final line art for my background, and it's of this sort of wacky cartoon castle here overlooking a moat, and I'm going to have the drawbridge down, bridging the gap here, and there's going to be running water obviously in the moat, and maybe I'll have some kind of fantasy creature like an ogre or something on the other side waiting to storm the castle, although he'll be on a cell animation or character layer, because of course this is the background, so it's going to be on a static layer and not actually animating itself, but I might animate some elements, like the running water in the middle here. Water is a difficult thing to do in backgrounds, because even if it's kind of very still and calm water, you still want it shimmering a little bit in the light, and you still want to animate that somewhat. We're going to have some cottages here in the background, maybe a couple of mountains and some trees, maybe a few hills. But yeah, basically now I need a great big drawbridge across the moat. A really big door, obviously, because a big drawbridge necessitates that you have a big door as well. So I'll make that tower a little bit taller. And going back to what we were talking about earlier with perspective, because we're basically looking up at everything in this shot, this means that we have a very low horizon line. And I've kind of cheated the perspective here. I've obviously not drawn my dots on, but I hardly ever do that. I think once you get to a point, especially when working with fairly cartoony animations, you can get away with cheating it and bending the perspective a little bit to suit your needs. I think that's about ready now to start cleaning up, so I'll play the cheesy intro music and get going on that. Okay, so here's our very cheap and cheerful line art for the background. Notice I actually didn't put any mountains in the background, and that's not because I don't want them in the shot. I actually don't think that I want them to have line art, and we'll come to that a little bit later. A few other things to note is I haven't drawn in any kind of waves or any kind of thing to denote water, and in my original thumbnail I was going to have a flag up here on the pole, and I've drawn the pole in, but I'm going to leave the flag till later and you'll see why. So now what I'm going to do is go to File and Export as image and export as a PNG, and then open it up in Photoshop. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop, and yes, I know not everyone has Photoshop, but not everyone has Flash either, and like I say, this is me showing you guys how I make my backgrounds. I've exported the line art as a PNG file, meaning that because it's a PNG, we don't have the plain background of the grey that we were working with in Flash, and we just have the line art, so we can actually begin to colour behind the line art, and I'll show you how that looks here. We have this sort of checkerboard pattern, but I've added in a new layer, and we can start to actually build up now some colour beneath that, and as you can see, it appears nicely below our line art. Obviously a royal blue is not right for our scene here, so I'm going to begin to lay in the basic flat tones for this background. So there we have most of the flat colour done, and it's very straightforward. They're all simple flat tones, there's no shading or anything like that happening yet. But a few things that I thought would be interesting to note was that the cottages here in the background are of quite a lighter, less saturated, brighter tone than all of the other colours, and that's because they're in the background. Being more removed from us and more distant, often tones get lighter and the hues kind of get more subtle. And to emphasize that fact, I'm actually going to go onto the line art layer here, and by selecting a brush with about 50% opacity, I'm just going to slightly take away the line art and make that less opaque, and hopefully sort of create the illusion that they're further in the distant hills and valleys beyond, and do the same here with these hills and make them look like they're in the distance as well. And I still need to select a colour for them, and now they're green, so I could just select my grass colour here, but because they're further in the distance, I'm going to make a brighter, slightly more blue hue of green, and could go a little lighter still, maybe. Yeah, something like that is actually pretty good. And I haven't put in any reflections yet, so I can do that now, just to give the illusion that there is water in the moat, and I haven't made the water a different colour. It's reflecting the sky, which makes it look very blue and clear. Actually, let's make that blue just a little bit more murky and dark. There we go. And now I'll actually add in the impression that the sides of the moat are being reflected. Maybe a bit of the drawbridge, just a little bit, and the hills as well. And that finally brings me to the mountains. Now the mountains, I decided I didn't want any line art on them at all because they're supposed to be so far in the distance, so I actually thought I'd colour them directly into Photoshop here. And typically a nice way to do mountains, I think, is to select a very, very pale blue, or whatever colour your sky is, get very close to that, and basically kind of just go wild, draw a big jagged shape, and then fill all that in. And now with our mountains filled in, we can select a light source, and I'm going to say that there's maybe a big sun up here in the top left, just out of shot, and actually we can throw one half of our mountains into shadow. And to do that, all I'm going to do is select another blue, even closer to the sky this time, just a little bit lighter, and basically go nuts, just separating big chunks of our mountain range into dark blue, and then filling those chunks in with that same blue. So hopefully now we have our much nicer, more 3D looking mountains, and they're more 3D looking because we have one half in shadow being thrown into shadow from our light source, and I'll just hint again as to where that is. It's up at the top left corner. And now that we have that, we can actually begin to shade the rest of our shot. And an easy and convenient way to do that without editing our other layers is to create a brand new layer below our line art but on top of our other shading and colouring layers, and make it black, or rather select a black brush and take the opacity of our new layer down to about 45-50%, and you can begin shading that way and editing the layer below. But if you don't like your shading, you can obviously erase it without disturbing the layers below. So bearing in mind that we have a light source coming from the top left, I'm going to shade our shot and get that looking pretty. Okay, that looks pretty good, but typically I don't like shadows that feel too sort of grey and dull, and even in real life shadows have some kind of colour to them, and you'll see sort of blues and greens appear in shadows. So what I can do is I can lock the layer here that I've just made, so I can only edit it and no others around it, and get a nice dusky blue and kind of just scribble over my shadows here and make the whole thing look, I think, a little brighter and a little bit more attractive. And I think ready now to put on highlights in much a similar way, actually, by creating a new layer again. But this time they'll be pure white, we won't change the colour afterwards, and I'll probably set the layer value to be different. I think we'll set it to be screen, and I'll do this in real time because we only want to add a few little touch-ups. That's a little bit too bright there. Maybe just the hint of something on the edge of the tower. Maybe just a few of the bricks that are sticking out there of the mortar could have a little highlight on them. Make the surface of the castle wall look a little less flat. And as well, I think I'll add a few highlights to the grass to make that look like it's a little less sort of matte and dry. Make it look a little more wet. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm fairly happy with that. So it's at this stage that really we can begin to wrap our background up. I think the only thing left to do is, first of all, I'm going to take down the opacity of our black line art just a touch more, so we're left with something that feels, to me, a little bit more painterly and not quite as severe, and I think should suit our 2D characters a little better. And one more trick, which is Photoshop specific, but hey, it kind of works, is to actually lock all this down into one layer. First of all, I'm going to add in a few clouds, and that's easily done by just getting a really nice kind of gentle brush and just sort of making these kind of cotton wool like blobs. Just having flashbacks to the opening of Toy Story now. Okay, and maybe just work some highlights into those clouds with a brighter white. Of course, they're being lit again by that sun, so the left-hand side is going to appear a little bit brighter there. And one more thing that I'm going to do is turn on the photo filter and actually give us a nicer, kind of perhaps warmer filter over the colours, which should make our background look like it's been maybe processed in a nice way. After that, I'm going to add in just the hint of a vignette in the bottom three rightmost corners, and I think we're done to import it back into our animation. So here's the final background. I added an animated flag and a shimmering effect on the water just to help keep the shot a little more alive. The ogre is an invisible ogre because I'm a huge fraud. I'll see you next week, folks. Thanks again.